I decided to visit my wife at her job as a CEO at the entrance. There was a sign that said authorized personnel only. When I told the guard I was the CEO's husband, he laughed and said, "Sir, I see her husband every day. There he is coming out right now." So I decided to play along. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached." I never thought a simple surprise visit would shatter everything I believed about my 28-year marriage. My name is Michael Thompson. I'm 56 years old, and until that Thursday afternoon in October, I thought I knew my wife Patricia better than anyone in the world. It started as such an innocent idea. Patricia had been working late again, pulling those 12 and 14-hour days that came with being CEO of Summit Industries. I'd been making dinner for one too many nights, eating alone while she texted me updates about board meetings and client emergencies. That morning, she'd rushed out without her usual coffee, and I thought bringing her favorite latte and homemade sandwich might brighten her day. The downtown office building gleamed in the autumn sunlight as I pulled into the visitor parking space. I'd only been to Patricia's office a handful of times over the years. She always said it was easier to keep work and home separate, and I respected that boundary. Maybe I respected too many boundaries. I walked through the glass doors carrying the coffee and brown bag, feeling oddly nervous. The lobby was all marble and chrome, the kind of intimidating corporate space that made me grateful for my quiet financial consulting practice. A security guard sat behind an imposing desk, his nameplate reading, "Carl Martinez." "Good afternoon," I said, approaching with what I hoped was a confident smile. "I'm here to see Patricia Brown. I'm her husband, Michael." Carl looked up from his computer screen, his expression shifting from professional courtesy to something I couldn't quite read. He tilted his head slightly, studying my face as if trying to solve a puzzle. "You said you're Mrs. Brown's husband." His voice carried a note of confusion that made my stomach tighten. "Yes, that's right. Michael Thompson. I brought her lunch." I held up the bag, suddenly feeling foolish. Carl's expression changed completely. His eyebrows shot up and then he did something that froze my blood. He laughed. Not a polite chuckle, but a genuine bewildered laugh that echoed through the marble lobby. "Sir, I'm sorry, but I see Mrs. Brown's husband every day. He just left about 10 minutes ago." Carl gestured toward the elevators with casual certainty. "There he is now, coming back." I turned, following his gaze, and watched a tall man in an expensive charcoal suit stride through the lobby. He was younger than me, maybe mid-40s, with the kind of confident bearing that seemed to own every room he entered. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. Everything about him screamed success and authority. The man nodded to Carl with familiar ease. "Afternoon, Carl. Patricia asked me to grab those files from the car." "No problem, Mr. Williams. She's in her office." Scott Williams, I knew that name from Patricia's work stories. Her vice president who joined the company 3 years ago, the man she occasionally mentioned in passing, always in professional context. Scott this, Scott that, always business. My hands went numb around the coffee cup. The brown bag crinkled as my grip tightened involuntarily. Everything in me wanted to speak up, to correct this massive misunderstanding, but my voice had completely abandoned me. Carl was looking between Scott and me now, genuine confusion creasing his features. "I'm sorry, sir, but are you sure you're Mrs. Brown's husband? Because Mr. Williams here is married to her." The words hit me like physical blows. Married to her. Present tense. Not was married, not claims to be married, but a simple matter-of-fact statement that shattered my reality. Scott paused mid-stride, his attention drawn to our conversation. When his eyes met mine, I saw something flicker across his face. Not guilt, not surprise, but recognition. He knew exactly who I was. "Is there a problem here?" Scott's voice was smooth, controlled, the voice of a man accustomed to managing difficult situations. Something cold and calculating passed through my mind in that moment. Every instinct screamed at me to explode, to demand answers, to create the scene this situation deserved. But a deeper wisdom, born from 28 years of reading people and financial consulting, told me to play along. "Oh, you must be Scott," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. "Patricia's mentioned you. I'm Michael, a friend of the family. I was just dropping off some documents for Patricia. The lie tasted bitter, but it bought me time to think." Scott's shoulders relaxed slightly, but his eyes remained watchful. "Ah, yes, Patricia's mentioned you too. Had she? What had she said?" "She's in meetings most of the afternoon, but I can make sure she gets whatever you brought." I handed over the coffee and sandwich, my movements mechanical. "Just tell her. Michael stopped by, of course." Scott's smile was perfectly professional, perfectly normal. as if we hadn't just had the most surreal conversation of my life. I walked back to my car in a daze, my legs moving without conscious direction. The October air felt sharp against my skin, but I barely noticed. Everything looked the same as when I'd arrived 30 minutes ago, but my world had fundamentally shifted. Sitting in the driver's seat, I stared at the office building through my windshield. 28 years of marriage. 8 years of sharing a bed, a home, dreams, fears, inside jokes that nobody else understood. 28 years of believing I knew this woman completely. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. "Running late again tonight. Don't wait up. Love you. Love you." The words that had once brought me comfort now felt like another lie in what was apparently a web of deception I'd been blind to. How long had this been going on? How many times had Scott been introduced as her husband while I sat at home making dinner for one, believing her stories about late meetings and business dinners? I started the car and drove home through familiar streets that suddenly felt foreign. Our house looked the same. The red brick colonial we'd bought when Patricia first made partner at her previous firm. The garden she'd insisted on planting our second year there. The mailbox with both our names printed in careful script. Everything exactly as I'd left it, except now I knew it was all built on lies. Inside, the silence felt different. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of a home waiting for its occupants to return. It was the hollow emptiness of a stage set, a carefully constructed facade. I walked through rooms filled with our shared memories. Vacation photos, wedding pictures, the ceramic bowl Patricia had made in that pottery class she'd taken 5 years ago. Had any of it been real? I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. My mind kept replaying the scene at the office, searching for clues I'd missed, explanations that might make sense of what I'd witnessed. But there was only one explanation that fit, and it was one I wasn't ready to accept. The front door opened at 9:30, just as it had countless times before. Patricia's heels clicked against the hardwood floor, her keys jangled as she set them on the hall table. Normal sounds of a normal evening, except nothing was normal anymore. "Michael, I'm home." Her voice carried the tired warmth I'd grown accustomed to over the years. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking every inch the successful CEO in her tailored navy suit, her blonde hair still perfectly arranged despite her long day. "How was your day?" I asked. The question automatic, she sighed, loosening her jacket. "Exhausting, back-to-back meetings all afternoon." "Did you eat already?" I nodded, studying her face for any sign of deception, any hint that she knew about my visit to her office. There was nothing. Her expression was exactly what it had always been. Tired, distracted, but genuinely glad to see me. "I brought you coffee today," I said carefully, "to your office." Patricia paused in the middle of reaching for a glass. For just a fraction of a second, something shifted in her expression. Then she smiled. "You did?" "I didn't get any coffee. I gave it to Scott to pass along." Another pause, so brief I might have imagined it. "Oh, Scott mentioned someone stopped by. I had back-to-back meetings all afternoon, so I probably missed it." She moved to the refrigerator, her back to me. "That was sweet of you to think of me." I watched her pour herself a glass of wine, noting how her hands remained perfectly steady. Either she was telling the truth, or she was the most accomplished liar I'd ever met. After 28 years of marriage, I was terrified to discover which one it was. The rest of the evening passed in a surreal pantomime of normalcy. We watched the news together, discussed our weekend plans, went through the same bedtime routine we'd followed for decades. But underneath it all, a terrible new awareness pulsed like a second heartbeat. As Patricia slept beside me, her breathing deep and peaceful, I stared at the ceiling and wondered how many other lies I'd been living with. How many times had she come home from spending the day being Scott's wife, only to slip seamlessly back into being mine? The numbers man in me started calculating. 3 years since Scott joined the company. How many late nights? How many business trips? How many times had she mentioned his name in passing, conditioning me to accept his presence in her professional life while he was actually inhabiting something much more personal? But the questions that haunted me most weren't about timelines or evidence. They were simpler and infinitely more devastating. Who was the woman sleeping next to me? And who had I been married to all these years? The next morning arrived with cruel normalcy. Patricia kissed my cheek before leaving for work, the same quick peck she'd given me for years. She wore her favorite perfume, the one I'd bought her for Christmas 2 years ago. Everything about her was familiar, comforting, exactly as it had always been. Except now I knew I was kissing a stranger. I called my office and told my assistant I'd be working from home. For the first time in my 15-year practice, I couldn't bear the thought of discussing investment portfolios and retirement planning. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that grew cold while I stared at Patricia's coffee mug in the sink. She'd used it that morning just like always. Had she been thinking about Scott while she drank from it? By noon, I found myself doing something I'd never done before. Going through Patricia's things, not frantically, not desperately, but with the methodical precision that had made me successful in financial consulting. I started with the obvious places: her home office, the desk, where she sometimes worked in the evenings. The drawers revealed nothing suspicious. Work papers, company letterhead, business cards from clients I recognized from her stories. Everything was exactly what it should be for a CEO who occasionally brought work home. But then I found something that made my stomach clench. A restaurant receipt from Chez Laurent, the French place downtown where we'd celebrated our anniversary 3 years running. Dated 6 weeks ago for 2 people, $68.50 in fur. I remembered that night clearly because Patricia had told me she was having dinner with a potential client, a female client from Portland, who was in town for just one evening. I stared at the receipt, my hands trembling slightly. The timestamp showed 8:15 p.m. We'd talked on the phone that night around 9:30. She'd sounded relaxed, happy, describing her challenging but productive client meeting. I'd been proud of her for landing what she described as a significant account, but this wasn't a business dinner receipt. No alcohol charges that would accompany client entertainment. No appetizers or desserts that Patricia would order to impress a potential client. Just 2 entrees and a bottle of wine. The kind of intimate dinner I thought was reserved for us. My phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. Patricia's name appeared on the screen. "Hi, honey," I answered, surprised by how normal my voice sounded. "Hey, I just wanted to check in. You sounded a little off this morning." Her voice carried genuine concern, the kind of caring attention that had made me fall in love with her 29 years ago. "Just tired," I said. "Didn't sleep well." "Maybe you should take a real break today. You've been working so hard lately." The irony of her suggestion wasn't lost on me. While I'd been working hard at my small practice, she'd apparently been working hard at maintaining 2 separate lives. "Actually, I was thinking about that dinner you had with the client from Portland. The one about 6 weeks ago. How did that work out?" A pause so brief that most people wouldn't notice it. But after 28 years of marriage, I knew Patricia's speech patterns. She was calculating. "Oh, that." It didn't pan out the way we'd hoped. She decided to go with a local firm. Her voice remained steady, casual. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious. You seemed excited about it at the time." "Well, you win some, you lose some." I could hear typing in the background. She was probably answering emails while talking to me, multitasking the way she always did. I should get back to this board meeting prep. "See you tonight?" "See you tonight." After she hung up, I sat staring at the receipt. Either she was lying about the client meeting or she was lying about the dinner. Either way, she was lying. I spent the rest of the afternoon like a detective in my own life, examining familiar things with new eyes. The credit card statements I'd always glanced at, casually trusting Patricia to handle our finances since she made 3 times what I did. Now I studied them line by line. Lunch charges on days when she told me she was brown bagging it to save money. Gas station purchases in neighborhoods across town, far from her usual routes. A charge at Barnes & Noble for $37.12 on a Tuesday afternoon when she'd supposedly been in back-to-back meetings. Patricia hadn't bought a book for pleasure reading in years, claiming she was too tired after work to focus on anything but trade magazines. But the most damning discovery came from her laptop. She'd left it open on the kitchen counter, something she'd been doing more frequently over the past year. I told myself I was just closing it to save battery, but my eyes caught a notification bubble in the corner of the screen. Scott Williams had sent her a calendar invitation. I shouldn't have clicked on it. I knew I was crossing a line, violating her privacy in a way that would have horrified me just 24 hours earlier. But 24 hours earlier, I'd believed my wife was faithful. The calendar invitation was for dinner. Tonight. 7 p.m. at Bellacourt, the Italian place that had become our special occasion restaurant, the place where I'd proposed to her 17 years ago. The reservation was under Scott's name. My chest tightened as I scrolled through more calendar entries, lunch meetings with Scott that weren't labeled as business, doctor's appointments that Patricia had never mentioned to me, a weekend spa retreat 3 months ago that she'd told me was a women's conference for female executives. But the entries that made me physically sick were the recurring ones: coffee with S every Tuesday morning at 8 a.m., dinner plans every other Thursday. Weekend planning marked for this coming Saturday when Patricia had told me she needed to work. I was looking at a parallel life, meticulously scheduled and carefully hidden. Scott wasn't just her work colleague or even her affair partner. Based on these calendar entries, he was her primary relationship. I was the side note, the obligation, the inconvenience worked around. The garage door rumbled open at 6:15. Patricia was home early, unusual for a Thursday. I closed the laptop quickly, my heart hammering as I heard her heels on the kitchen tile. "You're home early," I said, hoping my voice sounded normal. She looked beautiful, I realized with a sharp pang. She'd refreshed her makeup, her hair was perfectly styled, and she was wearing the black dress I'd bought her for her birthday last year. The dress, she'd said, was too fancy for everyday wear. I managed to wrap up early for once. She moved past me to the refrigerator, her perfume trailing behind her. "I thought maybe we could grab dinner out tonight. It's been forever since we did anything spontaneous." The lie was so smooth, so perfectly delivered, that I almost believed it myself. If I hadn't seen the calendar invitation, I would have been thrilled by her suggestion. I would have rushed to change clothes, grateful for this unexpected attention from my successful, busy wife. "Where did you have in mind?" I asked. "Oh, I don't know. Maybe that new sushi place on 5th Street, or we could try something completely different." She was checking her phone as she spoke, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. I watched her type, wondering if she was texting Scott. Was she canceling their dinner, rescheduling? Or was this part of some elaborate game I couldn't even begin to understand? "Actually," she said, looking up from her phone with apparent disappointment, "I just remembered I have that conference call with the Tokyo office. It totally slipped my mind." She shook her head ruefully. "Rain check." Of course, the words came out automatically, but inside something cold and hard was crystallizing. "What time is your call?" 7:30. "Could run until 9 or 10, you know how these international things go." She was already moving toward the stairs, toward our bedroom where she kept her work clothes. "I'll probably just grab something quick on my way back to the office." I nodded, playing my part in this elaborate deception. "I'll make myself something here." She paused at the bottom of the stairs, looking back at me with what appeared to be genuine affection. "You're so understanding, Michael. I don't know what I'd do without you." The words that should have warmed my heart instead felt like ice picks. How many times had she said variations of this while preparing to spend the evening with another man? How many times had I smiled and kissed her goodbye, unknowingly sending her off to her real life? I watched her climb the stairs, listening to her movements in our bedroom. She was changing out of the black dress, probably into something more businesslike for her conference call, or maybe into something entirely different for her dinner with Scott. 20 minutes later, she came back down wearing a navy blouse and dark slacks. Professional but attractive. Her makeup was perfect, her hair touched up. She looked like a woman preparing for an important evening, not someone settling in for a long phone conference. "I'll try not to be too late," she said, kissing my cheek, the same spot she'd kissed that morning, but now it felt like a betrayal instead of intimacy. "Take your time. I'll probably turn in early anyway." She gathered her purse, her laptop bag, her keys, the same routine I'd watched thousands of times. But now I knew I was watching an actress preparing to leave one performance for another. The house felt different after she left, not empty, but haunted. Every familiar object seemed to mock me with its false comfort. The wedding photos on the mantle, the vacation souvenirs on the bookshelf, the coffee table we'd picked out together 10 years ago when we'd redecorated the living room. All of it was real, but none of it meant what I'd thought it meant. I made myself a sandwich and sat in front of the TV, but I couldn't focus on anything. My mind kept circling back to the same impossible questions. How long had this been going on? How had I missed the signs for so long? And most devastatingly, had our entire marriage been a lie, or had something changed along the way? At 8:30, I found myself driving past Bellacourt. I told myself I was just going to the grocery store, that this route was perfectly normal. But when I saw Patricia's silver BMW in the restaurant parking lot, parked next to a dark Mercedes I assumed belonged to Scott, the last thread of hope I'd been clinging to snapped. They were in there right now, sharing the same kind of intimate dinner I thought was exclusive to our marriage. Was he telling her he loved her? Was she laughing at his jokes the way she used to laugh at mine? Were they planning a future that didn't include me? I drove home in a daze, the weight of my new reality settling around me like a heavy coat. My wife of 28 years was living a double life so complete, so seamlessly integrated, that I'd been completely blind to it. The woman I'd thought I knew better than anyone was a stranger. The marriage I'd believed was solid was apparently just the cover story for her real relationship. But perhaps the most shattering realization was this: I had no idea how long I'd been living this lie. and I had no idea what to do about it. The revelation came 3 days later in the most mundane way possible. I was cleaning out the junk drawer in the kitchen, something I did quarterly to keep our household organized, when my fingers closed around a key I didn't recognize. It was brass, worn smooth at the edges, attached to a keychain from Riverside Apartments across town. I stared at it for a long moment, my mind trying to process what I was seeing. We owned our house outright, had for the past 8 years. Neither of us had any reason to have an apartment key, let alone one from a complex 30 minutes away from our neighborhood. That afternoon, while Patricia was at what she'd called a client presentation, I drove to Riverside Apartments. The complex was nice, upscale, but not ostentatious, the kind of place where successful professionals might keep a discreet second residence. I sat in my car in the visitor parking area, staring at the key in my palm and wondering if I really wanted to know what door it opened. The answer came when I saw Scott's Mercedes pull into a numbered space. I watched him get out, carrying a grocery bag and what looked like dry cleaning. He moved with the easy familiarity of someone coming home, not someone visiting. When he disappeared into Building C, I waited exactly 10 minutes before following. The key fit perfectly into apartment 214. The door opened onto a life I never knew existed. It wasn't a temporary hiding place or a secret meeting spot. It was a home. A fully furnished, lived-in home with photos on the mantle, books on the shelves, and Patricia's favorite throw pillows arranged on a couch I'd never seen before. But it was the photos that destroyed me completely. Patricia and Scott at what looked like a company Christmas party, his arm around her waist in a possessive, intimate way. The two of them on a beach I didn't recognize, both tanned and relaxed, Patricia wearing a sundress I'd never seen. Scott kissing her cheek while she laughed, her left hand visible and notably bare of the wedding ring she wore at home. I moved through the apartment like a ghost, cataloging evidence of a relationship that was clearly far more than an affair. This was a second life complete and established. In the bedroom, Patricia's clothes hung next to Scott's in a shared closet. Her perfume sat on the dresser next to his cologne. The bathroom held 2 toothbrushes. Her contact solution, the expensive face cream she'd claimed was too costly to repurchase when she'd run out 6 months ago. On the kitchen counter, I found the most devastating evidence of all. A folder labeled Future Plans in Patricia's handwriting. Inside were house listings in Scott's name, vacation brochures for trips I'd never heard her mention, and a business plan for expanding Summit Industries with Scott listed as CEO and Patricia as president. But at the bottom of the folder was something that made my hands shake. A consultation summary from Anderson & Associates Family Law. The letterhead was familiar because Anderson & Associates was the firm that had handled our will updates 5 years ago. According to the summary, Patricia had met with them twice in the past 4 months to discuss optimal divorce strategies for high-asset individuals. The document outlined her approach in clinical detail. She planned to file for divorce citing irreconcilable differences and emotional abandonment. The strategy involved establishing a pattern of my alleged emotional unavailability supported by what the lawyer called lifestyle incompatibility evidence. According to this plan, my preference for quiet evenings at home would be presented as social isolation. My satisfaction with my small financial consulting practice would become lack of ambition. My contentment with our modest lifestyle would be reframed as inability to support her professional growth. But the most chilling part was the timeline. Patricia had been planning this divorce for at least 2 years, carefully documenting instances of what she called my withdrawn behavior. She'd been creating a narrative of our marriage that painted me as an inadequate husband who'd gradually become emotionally unavailable. The woman I'd been living with, loving, trusting, had been systematically building a case against me while I remained completely oblivious. I sat on their couch, surrounded by evidence of their shared life, and tried to process the magnitude of the deception. This wasn't just an affair that had gotten out of hand. This was a calculated replacement of one life with another. Scott hadn't just stolen my wife. He'd systematically assumed my role while I was gradually being written out of the story. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia, running late tonight. Don't wait up. Love you. Love you. The same words she'd probably texted me from this very apartment. Maybe while Scott was cooking dinner in their kitchen, or while they were planning their next vacation together. How many times had she sent me loving messages while actively living a completely different life? I photographed everything with my phone, my financial consultant's mind automatically creating the documentation I'd need later. The photos, the legal documents, the evidence of their shared residence. But as I worked, a strange calm settled over me. For 3 days, I'd been tormented by uncertainty, by the gap between what I knew and what I suspected. Now I had answers, and while they were devastating, they were also clarifying. Patricia hadn't just been having an affair. She'd been conducting an elaborate long-term plan to transition from one life to another, with me as the unwitting supporting character in my own replacement. When I got home, I found Patricia's laptop open on the kitchen counter again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I opened her email and found correspondence that confirmed everything I'd discovered at the apartment. Messages between Patricia and Scott discussing when to make the transition. Communications with her lawyer about preparing Michael for the inevitable changes. Even emails to our mutual friends, subtly preparing them for what she called some difficult decisions I'll need to make about my marriage. One email to her sister Jennifer, dated just 2 weeks ago, was particularly devastating. Michael's been so distant lately. I think he's going through some kind of midlife crisis, but he won't talk about it. I'm trying to be patient, but I can't sacrifice my own happiness indefinitely. Scott thinks I should consider all my options. Reading this, I realized that Patricia hadn't just been living a double life. She'd been actively rewriting our marriage history to justify her planned exit. Every quiet evening I'd spent reading while she worked on her laptop. Every time I'd encouraged her to pursue her career ambitions, even when it meant less time together. Every instance of my being supportive rather than demanding had been transformed into evidence of my inadequacy as a husband. The cruelest part was recognizing how she'd manipulated my own responses to support her narrative. When she'd started working later and traveling more, I'd been understanding. When she'd seemed stressed and distant, I'd given her space. When she'd suggested we needed better communication, I'd agreed to couples counseling, never realizing I was providing her with material to use against me later. That night, Patricia came home at nearly 1100, apologizing for her late evening with client entertainment. She kissed my cheek and asked about my day, the same routine we'd followed for years. But now I could see it for what it was. A performance designed to maintain the status quo until she was ready to execute her exit strategy. "How was the client dinner?" I asked, testing her reaction. "Productive, I think. We're trying to land this big contract, and sometimes these things require extra relationship building." She moved around the kitchen with practiced ease, making herself a cup of tea. Scott was there too, of course, since he'll be managing the account if we get it. Scott was there too. Of course he was. I wondered if they'd laughed about this conversation later in their shared apartment while planning their shared future. "That's good," I said. "You and Scott work well together." Patricia paused, cup halfway to her lips. "We do. He really understands the business side of things." There was something in her voice, a warmth that she used to reserve for talking about me. "He's been instrumental in some of our biggest wins lately." I nodded, playing my part in this elaborate charade. But inside, I was calculating. How long did I have before she filed for divorce? How much more evidence did she need to gather to support her strategy? How many more times would I kiss her goodnight while she planned my replacement? As I lay in bed that night, listening to Patricia's peaceful breathing beside me, I realized that the woman I'd been married to for 28 years was essentially gone. In her place was someone who could maintain this level of deception with apparent ease, someone who could plan my emotional and financial destruction while accepting my love and support. But perhaps most devastating of all was the recognition that I'd been living with a stranger for months, possibly years, without ever suspecting it. The Patricia I thought I knew, the woman I'd built my life around, had been gradually replaced by someone capable of this level of calculated betrayal. The question now wasn't whether my marriage was over. The question was whether it had ever really existed at all. I chose Saturday morning for the confrontation. Patricia was in our kitchen wearing the pale yellow robe I'd bought her 3 Christmases ago, sipping coffee from her favorite mug while scrolling through her phone. It was the kind of peaceful domestic scene that had once filled me with contentment. Now it felt like watching a performance I could no longer pretend to believe. "We need to talk," I said, setting the folder of evidence on the kitchen table between us. Patricia looked up from her phone, her expression shifting from casual attention to sharp awareness as she saw the documents. Her coffee mug paused halfway to her lips, and for just a moment, I saw something flicker across her face that might have been relief. "What's this about?" she asked, but her voice lacked the confusion it should have carried. She knew exactly what this was about. "I went to your apartment yesterday, the one at Riverside." I sat down across from her, noting how her shoulders straightened, how her breathing shifted to something more controlled. I used the key from our junk drawer. Patricia set down her mug with deliberate precision. When she looked at me again, the mask was gone. The loving wife, the concerned partner, the woman who'd been apologizing for late nights and long meetings had disappeared. In her place sat someone I barely recognized, someone whose eyes held a coldness I'd never seen before. I see. Her voice was calm, matter of fact. How much do you know? The question hit me like a physical blow. Not denial, not confusion, not even anger. Just a practical inquiry about the extent of my discovery, as if we were discussing a business problem that needed to be managed. Everything, I said. The apartment, Scott, the divorce planning, the legal strategy, all of it. Patricia nodded slowly, her fingers drumming against the table in a rhythm I recognized from her board meetings. She was calculating, processing, deciding how to handle this unexpected development in her carefully orchestrated plan. How long have you known? She asked. Since Thursday when I visited your office and the security guard told me he saw your husband every day. I leaned forward, studying her face for any sign of the woman I'd thought I'd married. He meant Scott. Something that might have been amusement passed across Patricia's features. Poor Carl. He's always been a bit too chatty. She reached for her coffee again, her movements unhurried. I suppose this complicates things. I could hear my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. Patricia, we've been married for 28 years. You've been living with another man, planning to divorce me. And all you can say is that this complicates things. She sighed, a sound of mild irritation rather than distress. Michael, let's not be dramatic about this. We both know this marriage has been over for years. We both know? I stared at her, searching for any trace of the woman who'd kissed me goodbye every morning, who'd said she loved me just 3 days ago. I didn't know anything. I thought we were happy. Patricia's laugh was short and utterly without humor. Happy? Michael, when was the last time we had a real conversation? When was the last time you showed any interest in my career, my goals, anything beyond your little consulting practice and your quiet evenings at home? I've always supported your career. I've always been proud of what you've accomplished. You've been passive, she corrected, her voice taking on the sharp edge I'd heard her use with underperforming employees. You've been content to let me carry the financial burden, the social obligations, the responsibility for actually building a life worth living. You've been perfectly happy to coast along in your comfortable little routine while I've been growing, changing, becoming someone who needs more than you've ever been willing to offer. Each word felt like a carefully aimed dart, hitting targets I didn't even know were vulnerable. If you felt that way, why didn't you talk to me? Why didn't you tell me what you needed? I tried, Michael. God knows I tried. But every time I brought up traveling more, expanding your practice, moving to a better neighborhood, you found excuses. You were always perfectly satisfied with exactly what we had, no matter how much I outgrew it. I thought about our conversations over the years, trying to remember these attempts at communication she was describing. There had been discussions about travel that I'd thought were casual daydreaming, suggestions about moving that I'd assumed were just idle speculation, comments about my practice that I'd interpreted as gentle teasing rather than serious criticism. So you decided to replace me instead of work with me. Patricia's expression softened slightly, but not with affection. It was the kind of gentle patience she might show a slow student. I didn't set out to replace you. I met Scott 3 years ago when he joined the company. He was everything you're not. Ambitious, dynamic, interested in building something bigger than himself. At first, it was just professional respect. Then it became friendship, then it became more. When did it become more? She considered this, tilting her head as if trying to recall the details of a business transaction. About 2 years ago, Scott had just closed his first major deal with us. We went out to celebrate, and we ended up talking until 3:00 in the morning about our dreams, our plans, the kind of life we wanted to build. It was the most stimulating conversation I'd had in years. You came home that night. I remember you said the client dinner ran late. It did, in a way. Patricia's voice was matter of fact, as if she were describing something that had happened to someone else. That's when I realized what I'd been missing. Scott listens when I talk about expanding the company internationally. He gets excited about the same opportunities that excite me. He wants to build an empire, not just maintain a comfortable existence. And that justified lying to me for 2 years. For the first time, Patricia showed a flash of real emotion, but it wasn't guilt or sadness. It was irritation. I wasn't lying, Michael. I was protecting you from a reality you weren't ready to face. Our marriage was already over. You just didn't want to see it. Our marriage was over because you decided it was over because you found someone who matched your ambitions better than I did. Our marriage was over because you stopped growing. Patricia stood up, moving to the window with the fluid grace that had first attracted me to her nearly 30 years ago. I kept hoping you'd develop some passion for something, anything beyond your routine. But you never did. You've been the same man at 56 that you were at 36, and I'm not the same woman. I stared at her profile against the morning light, recognizing the truth in her words even as they devastated me. I had been content with our life in ways that she apparently never was. I had found fulfillment in our quiet evenings, our modest successes, our stable routine. While she'd been dreaming of bigger things, I'd been grateful for what we had. So you and Scott have been planning to get rid of me. Patricia turned back to me, her expression businesslike. We've been planning our future. The divorce was always going to be necessary, but we wanted to handle it in a way that would be least disruptive to everyone involved. Least disruptive. I pulled out the legal consultation summary. You've been building a case against me for months. Emotional abandonment. Lifestyle incompatibility. You've been documenting everything I do to use against me later. She had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. The legal advice was to protect both of us. Divorce can get ugly if people aren't prepared. Protect both of us. Patricia, you've been systematically destroying my reputation with our friends, making me look like an inadequate husband who drove you to seek happiness elsewhere. I've been honest about the state of our marriage, she said defensively. If that makes you uncomfortable, maybe you should ask yourself why. The circular logic was dizzying. She'd been unfaithful, deceptive, and manipulative, but somehow I was the one being asked to examine my behavior. It was a level of psychological manipulation that left me feeling unmoored, questioning my own perceptions. Do you love him? I asked, surprising myself with the question. Patricia's expression softened for the first time during our conversation, but not in a way that offered me any comfort. I do. I love Scott in a way I never loved you. He challenges me, inspires me, makes me want to be better than I am. With him, I feel like I'm living instead of just existing. And with me, she looked at me for a long moment, her gaze neither cruel nor kind, just honest. With you, I felt safe, comfortable, unchallenged. For a long time, I thought that was enough, but it isn't, Michael. I want more than safe. I sat in silence, absorbing the weight of her words. 28 years of marriage, and what she'd valued most about me was my ability to provide emotional safety and comfort. What I'd seen as love and partnership, she'd experienced as stagnation and limitation. What happens now? I asked. Patricia sat back down, her posture relaxing as we moved into practical territory. Now we handled this like adults. I was going to file for divorce next month anyway. This just accelerates the timeline. Next month, Scott and I want to be married by Christmas. We've been planning a small ceremony, just immediate family. She paused, perhaps recognizing how this sounded. I was hoping we could make this transition as smooth as possible for everyone except me. Michael, you'll be fine. You have your practice, your routines, your simple pleasures. You'll probably be happier without the pressure of trying to keep up with someone like me. The condescension in her voice was breathtaking. Even in the midst of revealing her complete betrayal, she was positioning herself as the one doing me a favor by leaving, as if my contentment with our life had been a burden she'd been generously carrying all these years. I trusted you, I said quietly. I know you did, and I'm sorry it had to end this way. But Michael, we both deserve to be with someone who truly understands us. You deserve someone who appreciates your quiet strengths, and I deserve someone who shares my ambitions. She was rewriting our entire marriage as a mutual mismatch rather than a betrayal, transforming her infidelity into a kind of favor to both of us. It was masterful in its way, this ability to reframe devastating deception as enlightened self-awareness. When do you want me to move out? I asked. Patricia looked surprised. You don't have to move out immediately. We can work out the details through our lawyers. I'm not heartless, Michael. Not heartless. Just calculating, manipulative, and capable of maintaining an elaborate deception for years while planning my replacement, but not heartless. I stood up feeling older than my 56 years. I'll contact a lawyer on Monday. Michael, she called as I reached the kitchen doorway. When I turned back, she looked almost like the woman I'd thought I'd married, almost. I really am sorry it happened this way. I never wanted to hurt you. I studied her face, looking for any sign that she understood the magnitude of what she'd done. But there was only mild regret, the kind of polite sadness someone might feel about a business decision that unfortunately affected other people. No, I said quietly. You just wanted to replace me. The hurt was just collateral damage. As I walked upstairs to our bedroom, I could hear Patricia on the phone. Her voice was animated in a way it hadn't been during our conversation. She was calling Scott, I realized, telling him that the secret was out, that they could accelerate their timeline, that the inconvenient husband had finally been dealt with. I sat on the edge of our bed, surrounded by the remnants of a life I'd thought was real. The woman downstairs wasn't the person I'd married. Or maybe she was, and I'd simply never seen her clearly. Either way, the Michael who'd woken up that morning believing in his marriage was as gone as the Patricia who'd once loved him. Tomorrow, I would start the process of untangling 28 years of shared life. But tonight, I needed to grieve not just for my marriage, but for the man I'd been when I still believed in it. Monday morning, I sat across from Timothy Anderson, the same lawyer who'd handled our wills 5 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on me that Patricia had consulted with his firm about divorcing me while I was now seeking his help to protect myself from her plans. Michael, I have to tell you, this is one of the most calculated divorce strategies I've seen in 30 years of practice, Timothy said, reviewing the documents I'd brought him. Your wife has been building this case for a very long time. I nodded, watching him flip through photographs of the apartment, copies of the legal consultation notes, and printouts of Patricia's carefully documented evidence against me. What are my options? Timothy leaned back in his leather chair, his expression thoughtful. Well, the good news is that her strategy depends on you being unprepared and uninformed. The fact that you discovered this before she filed changes everything. He tapped the consultation summary. She was planning to paint you as emotionally unavailable and financially irresponsible. But we can counter that narrative. How? With facts. You've been the stable, supportive spouse for 28 years. You've never been unfaithful. You've supported her career advancement, and you've managed your joint finances responsibly. Timothy smiled grimly. More importantly, you have evidence of her systematic deception and adultery that matters even in a no-fault state. Over the next 2 hours, Timothy walked me through the reality of my situation. While Texas was indeed a community property state, Patricia's adultery and deception could impact the division of assets. More importantly, her documented plans to manipulate the divorce proceedings could seriously undermine her credibility with a judge. There's something else, I said, pulling out a folder I'd prepared over the weekend. Timothy raised an eyebrow as I spread out spreadsheets and bank statements across his desk. This was where my financial background became invaluable. While Patricia had been busy documenting my alleged emotional failures, I'd been quietly tracking our financial reality. Patricia makes $220,000 a year as CEO, I explained, but our joint expenses have been running about $75,000 more than her salary for the past 3 years. I've been subsidizing her lifestyle without realizing it. Timothy studied the numbers, his expression growing increasingly interested. My practice generates about $105,000 into our joint account, keeping only $40,000 for my business expenses and personal needs. I thought I was being generous, allowing her to save more of her salary for our future. I pointed to a series of withdrawals from our savings account. But she's been drawing down our joint savings to maintain the apartment with Scott. The apartment rent, the dinners, the weekend trips I'd never taken, the gifts she'd given Scott. All of it had been paid for with money I'd earned and contributed to what I'd believed was our shared future. This is fraud, Timothy said bluntly. She's been using marital assets to fund an adulterous relationship while planning to divorce you. That's going to significantly impact how a judge views the asset division. But I wasn't done. Over the weekend, I'd done something that felt foreign to my naturally trusting nature. I'd investigated my own wife's business dealings. What I'd found had shocked me even more than her personal betrayal. There's more, I said, pulling out another set of documents. Patricia's been positioning Scott to take over more responsibilities at Summit Industries. But according to the corporate filings I found, she's been doing it in ways that violate her fiduciary duty to the company's board. Timothy's eyes sharpened. Explain. Scott was hired as vice president of business development 3 years ago, but Patricia's been systematically transferring responsibilities to him that should require board approval. She's essentially been grooming him to replace her as CEO while positioning herself as president, but she's never presented this reorganization to the board officially. I'd spent hours reviewing publicly available corporate documents, cross-referencing them with the business plan I'd found in their apartment. Patricia and Scott's vision for the company's future involved significant structural changes that would require stockholder approval, but according to the official records, these changes had never been properly presented or voted on. She's been operating under the assumption that she can unilaterally restructure the company to benefit her relationship with Scott, I continued. But the board doesn't know about their personal relationship, and they certainly don't know about the corporate reorganization she's been implementing without their approval. Timothy was taking notes rapidly. Michael, this isn't just about your divorce anymore. If what you're saying is accurate, Patricia could be facing serious professional consequences. The thought gave me no pleasure. I'd loved this woman for 28 years, and I took no joy in uncovering evidence that could destroy her career. But I also couldn't ignore the reality that she'd been systematically betraying not just me, but her professional obligations as well. What do you recommend? I asked. "We file first," Timothy said without hesitation. "We get ahead of her narrative and present the facts before she can spin them. More importantly, we make sure the board at Summit Industries understands what's been happening under their noses." That afternoon, I did something that went against every instinct I'd developed over our 28-year marriage. I stopped protecting Patricia from the consequences of her actions. I called Philip Johnson, the chairman of Summit's board of directors. Philip and I had met several times at company functions over the years, and I'd always liked his straightforward approach to business. "Michael, what can I do for you?" Philip's voice was warm, unsuspecting. "Philip, I need to bring something to your attention regarding corporate governance issues at Summit. It's complicated, but I think the board needs to be aware of some structural changes that may not have been properly authorized." There was a pause. What kind of structural changes? I spent the next 20 minutes carefully outlining what I'd discovered, sticking to facts and avoiding personal details about my marriage. Philip listened without interruption, his questions growing more pointed as I described the unauthorized reorganization that had been taking place. "Jesus, Michael, are you saying Patricia's been implementing major corporate changes without board approval?" "I'm saying that based on the documents I've seen, there appears to be a significant disconnect between what's been happening operationally and what's been reported to the board. And you're bringing this to me because," I took a deep breath, "because I believe in corporate integrity and because the board has a right to know what's being done in their name." After I hung up, I sat in my office feeling a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. For years, I'd been the supportive husband who cleaned up Patricia's messes, smoothed over her occasional ethical shortcuts, and provided the stable foundation that allowed her to take professional risks. Now I was the one creating consequences she'd have to face. That evening, Patricia came home later than usual, her face tight with stress, her usual composed demeanor cracked around the edges. "We need to talk," she said, setting her briefcase down with more force than necessary. "About what?" "About the call Philip Johnson made to me this afternoon. About the corporate governance review the board has suddenly decided to conduct." Her eyes were hard, calculating. "About the fact that my own husband is apparently trying to destroy my career." I met her gaze steadily. I shared factual information about corporate reorganization that appeared to lack proper authorization. Nothing more. Don't play innocent with me, Michael. "You knew exactly what you were doing." "Yes, I did. The same way you knew exactly what you were doing when you spent 2 years planning my replacement." Patricia's composure finally cracked. "This is different, and you know it. This affects my professional reputation, my ability to make a living. Your affair with Scott affects that too. The board's going to find out eventually that you've been restructuring the company to benefit your personal relationship." I just gave them a heads up. She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her reassessing everything she thought she knew about me. The passive, supportive husband who'd never challenged her decisions was gone. In his place was someone who understood the value of information and wasn't afraid to use it. "What do you want?" she asked finally. "I want you to stop treating me like I'm stupid." I said, "I want you to acknowledge that your actions have consequences beyond your personal happiness. And I want you to understand that I'm not going to quietly disappear just because it would be convenient for your new life plan." Patricia sat down across from me, her posture defensive. "The board review will pass. There's nothing illegal about operational restructuring. Maybe not illegal, but unauthorized restructuring that benefits your romantic partner? That's going to be harder to explain. Especially when the board realizes you never disclosed your relationship with Scott." I could see her working through the implications, her quick mind calculating the political and professional costs of her choices. For the first time since I discovered her betrayal, Patricia looked genuinely worried. "What's it going to take to make this go away?" she asked. "It's not going away, Patricia. You set this in motion when you decided to live a double life. Now we all have to deal with the consequences. You're destroying everything I've worked for." I shook my head. "You destroyed it yourself. I'm just refusing to help you cover it up anymore." That night, as Patricia made phone calls behind closed doors and I could hear the stress in her voice, I realized something fundamental had shifted. For 28 years, I'd been the one adapting, accommodating, making space for her ambitions and choices. Now, for the first time, she was the one having to adapt to consequences she couldn't control. It wasn't revenge. Exactly. It was something quieter, but more powerful. The simple refusal to continue enabling someone who'd been systematically betraying me. Patricia had built her new life on the assumption that I would remain passive, predictable, manageable. She was about to discover how wrong that assumption had been. The next morning, I filed for divorce. But more importantly, I stopped being the man who made Patricia's life easier at the expense of his own dignity. After 56 years of believing that love meant endless accommodation, I was finally learning that sometimes love means knowing when to stop. The days that followed blurred together in a mixture of legal meetings, document preparation, and the strange sensation of dismantling a life I thought was permanent. Timothy had been right about filing first. By presenting our case before Patricia could implement her strategy, we'd shifted the entire narrative. The corporate governance review at Summit Industries moved with surprising speed. Philip Johnson took his fiduciary responsibilities seriously, and once he understood the scope of what had been happening without board oversight, he acted decisively. Within a week, an external audit firm had been brought in to review all operational changes implemented over the past 3 years. Patricia's attempts to manage the situation only made things worse. Her explanations to the board about evolutionary organizational development and responsive leadership structures sounded increasingly hollow when contrasted with the documented evidence of unauthorized decision-making. Scott Williams was the first casualty. Once the board learned about his relationship with Patricia, his position became untenable. The conflict of interest was so obvious that even Patricia couldn't argue against his termination. He was given 2 weeks severance and escorted from the building on a Thursday afternoon, his brief tenure as Patricia's corporate co-conspirator ending as abruptly as it had begun. For Patricia, the consequences were more complex. She'd built genuine value for Summit Industries over her years as CEO, and the board wasn't eager to lose that institutional knowledge. But her credibility had been severely damaged, and her autonomy was essentially gone. She was placed on probation, her compensation reduced by 30%, and her decision-making authority transferred to a newly appointed chief operating officer who would supervise her every move. The woman who'd built her identity around power and control now worked under closer oversight than a junior executive. I watched these developments unfold with a mixture of vindication and melancholy. Patricia had always prided herself on her professional competence, her ability to command respect in boardrooms, her reputation as a strategic thinker. Seeing all of that crumble because of choices she'd made in service of her personal desires was sobering, even for someone who'd been as thoroughly betrayed as I had. The divorce proceedings moved more smoothly than I'd expected. Patricia's lawyer, faced with the overwhelming evidence of her deception and financial misconduct, advised her to accept a settlement rather than risk a trial that would expose even more damaging details. I kept the house, which seemed fair given that my contributions had largely paid for it over the years. Patricia retained her retirement accounts and half of our liquid savings, minus the $47,000 she'd spent on maintaining her secret life with Scott. She also agreed to pay my legal fees, which Timothy had structured to be substantial but not punitive. The most satisfying aspect of the settlement wasn't financial, though. It was the acknowledgement in writing that Patricia had violated her fiduciary duties as a spouse and had used marital assets to fund an extramarital relationship. That document would become part of the public record, a permanent testament to the consequences of systematic deception. But even as I watched Patricia's carefully constructed world collapse around her, I found myself thinking less about her downfall and more about my own future. At 56, I was starting over in ways I'd never imagined. The house felt different without Patricia's presence, not empty exactly, but open to possibilities I hadn't considered in decades. I threw myself into my work with renewed energy, taking on new clients and expanding my practice in ways I'd been too comfortable to attempt before. The financial consulting business had evolved significantly in recent years, and I discovered that my methodical approach and attention to detail were well suited to helping people navigate complex retirement planning scenarios. One of my new clients was Susan Clark, a 48-year-old widow who'd inherited a substantial portfolio from her late husband and needed help managing it. She came to my office on a Tuesday afternoon in early December, carrying a folder of financial documents and wearing an expression of determined confusion that reminded me of my own early days in finance. "I'm completely out of my depth," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Richard handled all of this before he passed, and I'm terrified I'm going to make some terrible mistake and lose everything." Over the next hour, I walked her through her portfolio, explaining investment strategies and risk management in terms that weren't condescending, but were clear enough for someone new to financial planning. She asked intelligent questions, took careful notes, and displayed exactly the kind of thoughtful engagement I'd always hoped for in a client. "You make this sound so much less frightening," she said as our meeting concluded. "Richard always made it seem incredibly complicated, but the way you explain things actually makes sense. Financial planning isn't complicated," I said. "It just requires patience and consistency, the same principles that work in any other aspect of life." She smiled, and I noticed for the first time how warm her eyes were, how her whole face lit up when she wasn't worried about money. Would you mind if I asked you a personal question? Of course not. Are you married? I only ask because you seem to understand what it's like to have to start over, and I wondered if you'd been through something similar. The question caught me off guard. I'd become so accustomed to defining myself as Patricia's husband that I hadn't really considered how to describe my current status. Recently divorced, I said, after 28 years of marriage, so yes, I do understand about starting over. I'm sorry. That must be incredibly difficult. It was, I admitted, but not in the way I expected. It's been more liberating than devastating, if that makes sense. She nodded knowingly. It does. Richard was sick for almost 2 years before he died, and while I loved him and miss him terribly, there's something almost guilty relieving about not having to manage someone else's needs constantly. Does that sound awful? It sounds honest, I said, and honesty isn't awful, it's just rare. That conversation marked the beginning of something I hadn't expected to find again. Susan became a regular client, scheduling monthly meetings to review her portfolio and adjust her investment strategy. But those meetings gradually extended beyond strictly financial discussions. She was intelligent, thoughtful, and refreshingly direct in ways that Patricia had never been. Where Patricia had always seemed to be calculating the strategic value of every conversation, Susan simply said what she thought and asked for what she needed. It was a revelation to talk with someone who didn't treat communication as a form of manipulation. By February, our meetings had evolved into lunches that lasted well past our scheduled appointment times. By March, we were seeing each other socially, attending a symphony performance together, and discovering a shared appreciation for classical music that Patricia had always dismissed as pretentious. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, Susan told me one evening over dinner. For you to turn out to be hiding some terrible secret or planning to take advantage of me somehow. It's been so long since I've trusted someone that I've forgotten what it feels like. I understand that completely, I said. My wife spent 2 years planning to leave me while pretending nothing had changed. I'm still learning to believe that someone can actually mean what they say. What happened? She asked gently, if you don't mind talking about it. So I told her, not everything but the essential story. Patricia's double life, the apartment, the systematic deception, the way I discovered the truth almost by accident. Susan listened without interrupting, her expression growing more sympathetic as I described the scope of Patricia's betrayal. How did you get through it? She asked when I finished. I stopped trying to save something that was already gone. I said, I stopped protecting someone who was actively working against me. And I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's destructive choices. Susan reached across the table and took my hand. That must have taken incredible strength. It didn't feel like strength at the time, I admitted. It felt like survival. But looking back, I think you're right. It took strength to stop being the person Patricia needed me to be and start being the person I actually was. And who is that person? Susan asked, still holding my hand. I considered the question carefully. Someone who values honesty over harmony. Someone who believes that love should make you feel more like yourself, not less. Someone who's learned that contentment isn't a character flaw, it's a gift. That night, as I drove home through familiar streets that no longer felt foreign, I realized I was genuinely happy for the first time in years. Not the careful, conditional happiness I'd cultivated during my marriage, always mindful of Patricia's moods and expectations, but something deeper and more sustainable. Susan represented everything Patricia had dismissed as insufficient. Genuine warmth, uncomplicated affection, appreciation for simple pleasures. Where Patricia had needed constant stimulation and challenge, Susan found joy in quiet conversations and shared interests. Where Patricia had treated love as a transaction, Susan offered it as a gift. The contrast wasn't lost on me. For 28 years, I'd been trying to be enough for someone who had decided I wasn't. Now I was discovering what it felt like to be appreciated exactly as I was, without conditions or requirements for improvement. The official end of my marriage came in late April, when Patricia and I signed the final divorce papers in Timothy's office. She looked tired, older somehow, her usual polish dimmed by months of professional stress and personal upheaval. I hope you'll be happy, Michael, she said as we left the lawyer's office, her voice carrying what might have been genuine regret. I already am, I said, and meant it. Patricia paused on the sidewalk, looking at me with something that might have been surprise. You look different. Younger, maybe, or just lighter. I feel lighter, I said. It turns out that carrying someone else's deceptions is exhausting work. She flinched slightly at that, but didn't argue. For what it's worth, I never intended for things to get so complicated. Patricia, I said gently, you maintained 2 complete lives for 2 years, planned my replacement in excruciating detail, and used our money to fund your affair. That's not complicated, that's calculated. She nodded slowly, perhaps finally understanding the magnitude of what she'd done. I suppose I convinced myself that I was protecting you from painful truths, but really I was just protecting myself from difficult conversations. Yes, I said, we parted ways in front of the courthouse, and I felt no sadness watching her walk away. The woman I'd mourned was already gone, had been gone for years. The person walking away from me now was someone I'd never really known despite 28 years of marriage. That evening, Susan and I celebrated the end of my divorce proceedings with dinner at a small Italian restaurant across town, deliberately avoiding the places that held memories of my former life. She raised her wine glass in a toast. To new beginnings, she said. To honest endings, I replied. Sometimes that's the same thing. As spring turned to summer, my new life settled into rhythms that felt both familiar and fresh. My consulting practice continued to grow, fueled partly by referrals from satisfied clients like Susan, but also by my renewed energy and focus. Without the constant undercurrent of Patricia's dissatisfaction, I found myself more creative, more willing to take calculated risks with my business. Susan and I grew closer without the drama that had characterized my relationship with Patricia. There were no hidden agendas, no strategic calculations, no sense that every conversation was being evaluated for its usefulness in some larger plan. She liked me for who I was, not who I might become with sufficient improvement. In June, she helped me redecorate parts of the house, gently suggesting changes that would make the space feel more like mine rather than a museum of my former marriage. We painted the living room a warm blue that Patricia would have called too bold and replaced her carefully chosen furniture with pieces that actually reflected my taste rather than her image of what successful people should own. You have excellent instincts when you trust them, Susan told me one Saturday afternoon as we hung new artwork in the hallway. I think you'd forgotten that. She was right. For years, I deferred to Patricia's opinions on everything from home decoration to restaurant choices, accepting her judgment that my preferences were too simple, too modest, too unreflective of our success. Now, surrounded by things I'd actually chosen, I remembered what it felt like to trust my own taste. The transformation wasn't just aesthetic. Friends who'd known Patricia and me as a couple began to comment on how different I seemed, how much more relaxed and engaged. Some of them admitted they'd always felt a certain tension around Patricia, a sense that every social interaction was being evaluated and scored. She was always so perfectly put together. Our neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, told me one evening when she stopped by to borrow some gardening tools. But you never seemed quite comfortable around her, if you don't mind me saying so. You always looked like you were waiting for criticism. The observation was more accurate than I'd realized. I'd been waiting for criticism, for the subtle ways Patricia would let me know that my contributions to conversations were insufficient, my opinions too conventional, my social instincts inadequate for someone married to a CEO. With Susan, I felt no such anxiety. She laughed at my jokes, asked for my opinions, and seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts on everything from current events to the books we were reading. It was liberating to discover that I was actually quite good company when I wasn't constantly worried about being found wanting. The news about Patricia's continuing troubles reached me through the professional grapevine. Summit Industries' board had never fully restored her authority, and the stress of working under constant supervision had apparently taken its toll. She'd made several strategic errors in recent months, alienating key clients and failing to meet performance metrics that had been automatic for her in previous years. There were rumors that the board was considering replacing her entirely, though they were apparently reluctant to create more instability in the company's leadership. Scott Williams had moved back to Denver, where he'd taken a position with a much smaller firm at significantly reduced compensation. The brief period when he'd seemed destined for executive success at Summit Industries was now just an embarrassing footnote in his professional history. I felt no satisfaction in these reports. Patricia's professional downfall hadn't been my goal. Protecting myself and my assets had been, but her choices had created a cascade of consequences that extended far beyond our marriage, affecting her career, Scott's future, and the stability of a company that employed hundreds of people. It was a sobering reminder that deception always costs more than the deceiver anticipates. As autumn arrived, Susan and I began discussing the possibility of moving in together. We'd been seeing each other for almost a year, and our relationship had developed the kind of steady intimacy that Patricia had always dismissed as boring, but which I now recognized as precious. "I don't need grand gestures or constant excitement," Susan told me one evening as we sat on my back porch watching the sunset. "I need someone who's present, who says what they mean, who doesn't make me guess what they're thinking." Patricia always said I was too predictable, I said. Too content with ordinary things. "Patricia sounds like she confused drama with passion," Susan replied, "but they're not the same thing. Drama is exhausting. Passion is sustaining." She was right, of course. My relationship with Patricia had been filled with the kind of low-level tension that masquerades as excitement but is actually just anxiety. With Susan, I felt peaceful in ways that had nothing to do with boredom and everything to do with trust. In November, I received an unexpected phone call. Patricia's name appeared on my screen, the first time she'd contacted me since our divorce had been finalized. "Michael," she said when I answered, "I hope I'm not disturbing you. What can I do for you, Patricia?" There was a long pause. I wanted to apologize for how everything happened, for the way I handled things. I waited, saying nothing. "I know you probably don't want to hear this, but I've had a lot of time to think about what I did, about the choices I made." Another pause. "You didn't deserve what I put you through." No, I didn't. I convinced myself that our marriage was already over, that I was just being honest about reality. But the truth is, I ended it long before I admitted it to myself. I ended it when I decided you weren't enough anymore, instead of trying to work with you to build something better. I found myself genuinely curious about this conversation. What's prompted this reflection? Patricia let out a sound that might have been a laugh, but without humor. "Losing everything I thought I wanted. Scott and I lasted exactly 6 weeks after he moved to Denver. Turns out our great love affair was more about the excitement of secrecy and the thrill of planning a new life than about actually wanting to live together day to day." "I'm sorry to hear that, are you?" She sounded genuinely curious. I considered the question honestly. "Yes, I am. I'm sorry you threw away 28 years for something that wasn't real. I'm sorry you hurt so many people in pursuit of something that didn't exist. I'm sorry you discovered too late that what we had was actually valuable. Do you ever think about what might have happened if I'd just talked to you? If I'd been honest about feeling restless instead of creating this whole elaborate deception?" Sometimes I admitted, "But Patricia, the problem wasn't that you felt restless or wanted more from life. The problem was that you chose deception and betrayal instead of honest communication. You chose to replace me instead of working with me. I know that now, do you? Because even in this apology, you're focusing on the outcome that didn't work out for you, not on the damage you caused along the way. You're sorry that your strategy failed, not sorry that your strategy involved systematically lying to someone who loved you." Silence stretched between us. "You're right," she said. "Finally, even now, I'm still making it about me." "Yes, you are. I hope you're happy, Michael. I hope you found someone who appreciates what I was too selfish to value. I have. Her name is Susan, and she's everything you never were. Honest, kind, and capable of love without manipulation. Good. You deserve that." After she hung up, I sat in my living room, thinking about the strange journey that had brought me to this peaceful evening. A year ago, I'd been living a lie without knowing it, married to someone who was systematically planning my replacement while accepting my love and support. Now I was alone in my own home, but not lonely, starting over, but not starting from scratch. I'd learned that contentment wasn't a character flaw, and that my capacity for loyalty and trust, while it had made me vulnerable to exploitation, was also what made me capable of real intimacy with someone who shared those values. Patricia had seen my satisfaction with our quiet life as evidence of my limitations. Susan saw it as evidence of my ability to find joy in authentic connection rather than needing constant external validation. The difference wasn't in what I offered, but in who was receiving it. Susan arrived at 8 o'clock, carrying takeout from our favorite Thai restaurant and a bottle of wine. She kissed me hello and settled onto the couch beside me, her presence filling the house with warmth that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with genuine affection. "Good day?" she asked, curling up against my side. "Interesting day," I said, and told her about Patricia's call. Susan listened thoughtfully, her head resting on my shoulder. "How do you feel about it?" she asked when I finished. "Relieved mostly," I said, not because she apologized, but because it confirmed that I made the right choice. She's still focused on how her actions affected her, not on how they affected the people she hurt. Even her regret is self-centered. "That's sad," Susan said. Not for you, but for her. She's never going to be happy if she can't learn to consider other people's feelings as real as her own. It was a generous observation, more charitable than Patricia deserved, but typical of Susan's approach to the world. She had the rare ability to feel compassion for people without excusing their behavior, to understand motivations without accepting poor choices. "I think you're right," I said. "But that's not my problem to solve anymore." "No, it's not." Susan lifted her head to look at me. "Are you sure you're okay?" That must have brought up a lot of old feelings. I considered her question carefully. It did, but not the ones I expected. I thought I might feel angry or hurt all over again. Instead, I just felt distant from it, like she was talking about someone else's life. Because in a way, she was, Susan said. The person you were when you were married to her doesn't exist anymore. You've become someone different, someone who wouldn't tolerate that kind of treatment. She was absolutely right. The Michael who'd spent 28 years accommodating Patricia's moods, making excuses for her behavior, and accepting responsibility for her dissatisfaction was gone. In his place was someone who understood his own worth, who recognized manipulation when he saw it, and who refused to enable destructive choices. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had been a gradual process of learning to trust my own perceptions, to value honesty over harmony, and to understand that love shouldn't require me to diminish myself to make someone else comfortable. Over dinner, Susan and I talked about our plans for the holidays. Her daughter would be visiting from college, and I was looking forward to meeting her. Patricia and I had never had children, a decision that had seemed practical at the time, but which I now suspected had been influenced by her reluctance to share attention or resources. "She's very protective of me," Susan warned, smiling. "She's seen me through some difficult times, and she's going to interrogate you thoroughly." "I welcome the interrogation," I said. "Anyone who cares enough about you to be suspicious of new people in your life is someone I want to get to know." That evening, as we cleaned up the dinner dishes together, I marveled at how natural this felt. There was no underlying tension, no sense that I was being evaluated or found wanting. Susan appreciated my help without making it feel like an obligation, and I offered it without feeling taken for granted. It was such a contrast to the dynamic I'd shared with Patricia, where every domestic interaction had carried the weight of her professional stress and my supposed inadequacy. Susan and I moved around each other in the kitchen with an easy rhythm, comfortable in each other's space, without needing to fill every moment with conversation. "I've been thinking about something," Susan said as we finished loading the dishwasher. "What's that, about moving in together? I know we've discussed it, but I wanted to make sure you're not just going along with the idea because you think it's what I want." I turned to face her fully. "Why would you think that?" "Because you spent 28 years accommodating someone else's wishes, and I don't want to become another person whose needs you prioritize over your own." The observation was perceptive and caring in ways that took my breath away. Patricia had never shown such consideration for my autonomy, never worried that she might be taking advantage of my accommodating nature. She'd simply assumed that my willingness to defer was a resource she could tap indefinitely. "Susan," I said, taking her hands, "I want to live with you because I've never been happier than I am when we're together. Not because I think I should want it or because you expect it, but because it's what I genuinely want for my life. Are you sure?" "I'm sure. For the first time in decades, I know exactly what I want, and I want this. I want us," she smiled, the kind of radiant expression that had first attracted me to her. "In that case, yes, let's do this." We spent the rest of the evening making practical plans. Susan would keep her house as a rental property, providing additional income and maintaining her financial independence. We'd redecorate my house together, making it truly ours rather than mine or hers. She'd move in after the new year, giving us both time to prepare for the transition. "I never thought I'd live with someone again," she admitted as we sat on the couch, planning room arrangements. "After Richard died, I was so exhausted from taking care of someone else's needs that I couldn't imagine sharing space with another person." "What changed your mind?" "You did," she said simply. "Being with you doesn't feel like work, it feels like coming home." I understood exactly what she meant. My marriage to Patricia had been exhausting in ways I'd never fully acknowledged, a constant effort to be the person she needed me to be, rather than the person I actually was. With Susan, I could simply exist without performance or apology. Later that night, after Susan had gone home to prepare for an early client meeting, I walked through my house and tried to imagine it filled with her presence. Her books on the shelves beside mine, her coffee mug next to mine in the cabinet, her laughter filling rooms that had been too quiet for too long. The prospect filled me with anticipation rather than anxiety. At 56, I was embarking on a new chapter that felt both unexpected and inevitable. The man who'd been so devastated by Patricia's betrayal just over a year ago had discovered not only that he could survive without her, but that he could thrive. The holidays brought a sense of closure I hadn't expected. Susan's daughter, Emily, proved to be as wonderful as her mother had promised. She was a junior at the University of Texas, studying journalism with her mother's warmth and an additional layer of youthful curiosity about the world. "So you're the man who's made my mom smile again," she said during our first meeting, her tone direct but friendly. "I hope so," I replied. "She certainly made me smile." Emily studied me with the intensity of someone who'd learned to be protective of people she loved. "Mom told me about your ex-wife." That sounds like it was really difficult. It was, I said honestly, but it taught me some important things about myself and what I actually want from a relationship. Which is what? Honesty, loyalty, someone who likes me as I am instead of seeing me as a project to be improved. Emily nodded approvingly. Good answer. Mom deserves someone who appreciates her without trying to change her. Over the course of her week-long visit, I watched the easy affection between Susan and her daughter and felt a pang of something that might have been regret. Patricia and I had discussed having children early in our marriage, but she'd always found reasons to postpone. Her career was just taking off, the timing wasn't right, we needed to be more financially stable. Eventually we'd stop discussing it altogether. Now I wondered if her reluctance had been less about timing and more about a fundamental unwillingness to share attention or resources. Children would have complicated her ability to maintain the kind of carefully controlled image she valued, would have made her elaborate deception infinitely more difficult to manage. "Do you ever regret not having kids?" Susan asked one evening after Emily had returned to school. Sometimes, I admitted, "Especially when I see the relationship you have with Emily, but I'm not sure Patricia and I would have been good parents together. She was too focused on appearances, too controlling. Kids need space to be themselves. You could still be a father," Susan said gently. "Emily would love to have a stepfather who actually cares about her well-being." The suggestion both thrilled and terrified me. At 56, I'd assumed that particular chapter of life had closed permanently, but watching Emily over the holidays, seeing how she responded to genuine interest and affection, I realized I might have more to offer as a parent figure than I'd ever imagined. "Is that something you'd want?" I asked. "For me to be part of Emily's life in that way?" "I'd love it," Susan said. "She needs someone stable and caring in her life. Someone who won't disappear when things get complicated. You're exactly the kind of man I'd want as a role model for my daughter." That conversation stayed with me as we began the process of truly combining our lives. Susan moved in during the first week of January, and the transition was smoother than either of us had anticipated. Her furniture blended well with mine, her books found natural places on my shelves, and her morning routine complemented mine without conflict. The house felt alive in ways it never had, even during the best years of my marriage to Patricia. Susan sang while she made coffee, left notes in my lunch bag, and filled the rooms with the kind of comfortable domesticity I'd never experienced. "This feels right," she told me one Saturday morning as we sat at the kitchen table, reading different sections of the newspaper and sharing occasional observations about the news. "It does," I agreed. I never realized how much energy I was spending trying to avoid conflict until I didn't have to anymore. The contrast with my previous marriage was striking. Where Patricia had treated every domestic interaction as a potential source of criticism or evaluation, Susan approached our shared life with genuine pleasure. She enjoyed cooking together, appreciated help with household tasks, and never made me feel like my contributions were inadequate. Most importantly, she seemed to actually like my company, not tolerate it, not endure it, but genuinely enjoy the experience of being around me. It was a revelation to discover what it felt like to be with someone who found my conversation interesting, my humor amusing, and my presence comforting rather than disappointing. My business continued to flourish, partly because of referrals from Susan's network, but mostly because I'd found a new confidence in my professional abilities. Without Patricia's constant suggestions for improvement or expansion, I discovered that I was actually quite good at what I did, and that there was real value in my methodical, conservative approach to financial planning. "You've changed," my longtime client, Mrs. Patterson, told me during one of our quarterly meetings. "You seem more confident, more decisive. Whatever you've been doing differently, keep doing it." What I'd been doing differently was living with someone who appreciated my natural instincts instead of questioning them, someone who saw my caution as wisdom rather than timidity, my contentment as strength rather than limitation. In February, I received news that Patricia had finally resigned from Summit Industries. The board had apparently grown tired of the ongoing drama and decided that a fresh start with new leadership was preferable to the continued uncertainty surrounding her position. She's planning to start her own consulting firm, Timothy Anderson told me when he called with the news. Apparently thinks she can rebuild her reputation by going independent. I hope she succeeds, I said, and meant it. Not because I felt any lingering affection for Patricia, but because her continued professional struggles didn't serve any useful purpose. I'd gotten the justice I'd needed. Her ongoing difficulties were just collateral damage from choices she'd made. Susan was less charitable. After everything she put you through, you're a better person than I am, she said when I told her about Patricia's resignation. I wouldn't care if she never worked again. Her professional downfall was never the goal, I said. Protecting myself was. The rest is just consequences she created for herself. Still, Susan said, you're remarkably generous towards someone who treated you so badly. I'm not generous, I said. I'm just done carrying anger that doesn't serve any purpose. Patricia made her choices, and now she has to live with them. I've made mine, and I'm very happy with them. That evening, as we prepared dinner together in our shared kitchen, I reflected on how profoundly my life had changed. 18 months ago, I'd been living a lie without knowing it. Now I was living a truth that felt more solid and satisfying than anything I'd experienced in decades. Penny for your thoughts, Susan said. Noticing my distraction, just thinking about how different everything is now, I said, how different I am. You're not different, she said, setting down her knife and turning to face me. You're yourself, maybe for the first time in years. She was right, as she often was. The changes I'd experienced weren't really changes at all. They were revelations. I'd rediscovered parts of myself that had been buried under years of trying to be the husband Patricia needed, the partner who could somehow fill the gaps in her satisfaction with life. With Susan, I didn't need to be anyone other than who I actually was. My dry sense of humor, my preference for quiet evenings, my methodical approach to problem solving, all the qualities Patricia had seen as limitations, Susan appreciated as features, not bugs. I love you, I said, the words coming easily and naturally. I love you too, she replied, reaching up to kiss me, all of you. Even the parts you used to think weren't good enough. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it a sense of renewal that felt appropriate for where my life had landed. Susan and I began planning a small garden together, choosing plants and designing flower beds with the kind of collaborative enthusiasm I'd never experienced with Patricia. I've never gardened with someone before, Susan confessed as we marked out plots in the backyard. Richard always said it was my hobby and left me to it. This is much more fun. Patricia thought gardening was beneath her, I said. Too mundane for someone with her ambitions. Her loss, Susan said simply. There's nothing mundane about creating something beautiful together. That became the theme of our relationship, creating something beautiful together. Not just the garden, but a life that reflected both of our values and interests. We took cooking classes, learned to tango, and planned weekend trips to places neither of us had ever visited. With Patricia, every shared activity had been evaluated for its potential to enhance her image or advance her career. With Susan, we did things simply because we enjoyed them, because they brought us pleasure or helped us learn something new about each other. Emily visited again in March, this time bringing her boyfriend, a journalism major named Ryan, who clearly adored her. Watching the young couple together reminded me of what healthy relationships looked like: mutual respect, genuine affection, and the kind of easy communication that comes from actually liking the person you're with. They're good together, I told Susan as we watched Emily and Ryan help each other prepare lunch. They are. She agreed. Emily learned some important lessons from watching me navigate relationships over the years. She knows what to look for and what to avoid. What did you teach her to avoid? People who make you feel like you need to be someone else to earn their love, Susan said. People who keep score instead of keeping faith. People who see your kindness as weakness rather than strength. It was a perfect description of what had been wrong with my marriage to Patricia. I'd spent 28 years trying to earn love that was always conditional, always subject to revision based on her evolving requirements for what a successful husband should be. You taught her well, I said. I had good motivation, Susan replied. I wanted her to find what we have. What we had was still developing, still deepening in ways that surprised me daily. At 56, I'd thought I understood what love was supposed to feel like. Patricia and I had been passionate in our early years, and I'd confused intensity with intimacy, drama with depth. With Susan, I was learning that real love wasn't about constant stimulation or challenge. It was about feeling safe enough to be vulnerable, appreciated enough to be authentic, and valued enough to trust that tomorrow would be as good as today. We began discussing marriage in April, not as an urgent need, but as a natural next step. Neither of us was in a hurry. We'd both learned the importance of taking time to really know someone, but we were both certain about our future together. I never thought I'd want to be married again. Susan admitted one evening as we sat on the back porch, admiring our emerging garden. After Richard died, I was so exhausted from being responsible for someone else's happiness that I couldn't imagine taking on that burden again. But this doesn't feel like a burden, I said. No, it doesn't, because you don't expect me to be responsible for your happiness. You're happy on your own, and you share that happiness with me rather than demanding that I create it for you. The distinction was crucial. Patricia had always treated me as a supporting actor in the drama of her life, someone whose primary job was to enhance her experience and minimize her difficulties. Susan and I approached our relationship as equal partners, each bringing our own fulfillment to share rather than demanding completion from the other. In May, I proposed, not with a grand gesture or elaborate planning, but during a quiet moment in our kitchen while she made coffee and hummed along to the radio. It felt right to propose in the space where we'd shared so many ordinary moments, where we'd built the foundation of our extraordinary partnership. "Will you marry me?" I asked, presenting the simple solitaire ring I'd chosen with the help of Emily, who'd insisted her mother would prefer elegance over ostentation. Susan set down her coffee mug and stared at the ring, tears forming in her eyes. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'd love to marry you." We held each other in our kitchen, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of a life genuinely shared, and I marveled at how perfectly this moment felt. Not because it was dramatic or overwhelming, but because it was real in ways that my first marriage had never been. We planned a small wedding for late summer, inviting only close friends and family. Emily would serve as Susan's maid of honor, and my brother David would fly in from Seattle to be my best man. It would be simple, intimate, and focused on what actually mattered, the commitment we were making to each other. "I want this wedding to be everything my first one wasn't," Susan told me as we discussed our plans. "Honest, joyful, and about us rather than about impressing other people." My first wedding to Patricia had been a grand affair designed more for her professional network than for our personal celebration. Looking back, I realized how much of that day had been performance, how little of it had reflected who we actually were or what we meant to each other. This wedding would be different. We wrote our own vows, chose readings that reflected our actual beliefs rather than social expectations, and planned a reception that would feel more like a dinner party than a corporate event. The weeks leading up to the ceremony were filled with the kind of anticipatory joy I'd never experienced before. Instead of stress about details and appearances, there was simple excitement about celebrating our commitment with people we cared about. "You seem lighter, my client," Mrs. Rodriguez observed during a meeting in July. "Marriage must agree with you. This marriage does," I said. "I'm learning that the right relationship doesn't feel like work. My husband and I have been married for 43 years, she said. "The secret isn't finding someone you can live with, it's finding someone you can't imagine living without." That perfectly described how I felt about Susan. Not desperate dependence, but genuine preference for a life that included her over one that didn't. She enhanced my happiness without being responsible for it, complemented my strengths without trying to fix my supposed weaknesses. 2 weeks before our wedding, I received another unexpected call from Patricia. Her name on my phone screen no longer caused the sharp pang of betrayal it once had. Instead, I felt only mild curiosity about what might prompt her to contact me again. "Michael," she said when I answered, "I heard through mutual friends that you're getting married again. I wanted to congratulate you." "Thank you," I said, genuinely surprised by the gesture. "I also wanted you to know that I'm doing better," she continued. "I've started therapy and I'm learning some things about myself that I probably should have learned years ago. I'm glad to hear that. I know this is probably too little too late, but I want you to know that I understand now what I did to you. Not just the affair, but the systematic way I undermined your confidence and made you question your own worth. That was cruel and it was wrong." This apology felt different from her previous call, less self-focused, more aware of the actual damage she'd caused. "I appreciate you saying that," I said. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said quickly. "I just wanted you to know that someone who hurt you very badly has finally learned enough to understand the magnitude of what they did. You deserve to hear that acknowledgement. Thank you," I said, and meant it. Not because the apology changed anything fundamental, but because it represented growth that might prevent her from causing similar damage to someone else. "I hope you're very happy," she said. "You deserve someone who appreciates you exactly as you are." After she hung up, I sat in my office thinking about the conversation. The woman on the phone had sounded more genuine, more self-aware than the Patricia I'd known. Perhaps losing everything she'd thought she wanted had forced her to examine the choices that had brought her to that point. I felt no desire to resume any kind of relationship with her, but I could acknowledge that her growth was a positive development. The man I'd become over the past 2 years was capable of wishing her well without needing to be part of her journey. That evening, I told Susan about the call. She listened thoughtfully, her response characteristically generous. "It sounds like she's finally learning to take responsibility for her actions," she said. "That's good for everyone, including her future relationships." "Do you think she's being sincere?" I asked. "I think it doesn't matter," Susan said gently. "Whether or not she means it, you've already moved on. Her apologies can't change what happened, and you don't need them to be happy." She was absolutely right. Patricia's acknowledgement of her wrongdoing was satisfying in an abstract way, but it didn't alter the reality of my current life. I'd already found peace, happiness, and love with someone who'd never made me question my worth or doubt my perceptions. Our wedding day arrived with perfect August weather, warm but not humid, with a gentle breeze that made the outdoor ceremony comfortable for everyone. Susan looked radiant in a simple ivory dress that complemented her natural beauty without overwhelming it. Emily beamed with pride as she adjusted her mother's veil, and even my usually reserved brother David seemed moved by the obvious joy of the occasion. As I waited for Susan to walk down the aisle, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment, the devastating discovery of Patricia's betrayal, the difficult process of divorce, the gradual rebuilding of my confidence and trust, and finally the unexpected gift of finding someone who loved me not despite my supposed limitations, but because of my actual strengths. "Ready?" David asked, straightening my tie. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life," I replied. When Susan appeared at the end of the garden path, arm in arm with Emily, I felt a surge of gratitude so profound it took my breath away. Not just for this moment, but for all the moments that had led to it, including the painful ones that had taught me what I truly valued in a partner. She looked beautiful, confident, genuinely happy in a way that made everyone around her smile just from witnessing it. As she walked toward me, I understood what people meant when they talked about marriage being a celebration rather than just a ceremony. This wasn't just about legal documents or social recognition. It was about two people publicly declaring their commitment to building a life together based on mutual respect, honest communication, and authentic love. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful. Our officiant, a longtime friend of Susan's family, spoke about marriage as a partnership between equals, about the importance of maintaining individual identity within shared commitment, about love as a choice renewed daily rather than a feeling that simply happens to you. When it came time for our vows, I looked into Susan's eyes and spoke the words I had written from my heart. "Susan, for most of my adult life, I believed that love meant making myself smaller to make someone else comfortable. You taught me that real love means being seen and accepted exactly as I am, while also seeing and accepting you exactly as you are. I promise to be honest with you always, to support your dreams without trying to control them, and to build a life with you that honors both of our authentic selves. I promise to choose you every day, not because I need you to complete me, but because I want to share my complete self with you." Susan's vows brought tears to my eyes and to those of nearly everyone present. "Michael, you showed me that love doesn't have to be complicated to be profound. Your kindness, your integrity, and your capacity for joy taught me that the person I'd been looking for wasn't someone who would challenge me to become different, but someone who would appreciate who I already am. I promise to love you, not just in the easy moments, but especially in the difficult ones. I promise to be your partner, your friend, and your safe haven today and always." When we kissed as husband and wife, the applause from our small gathering felt like a celebration not just of our union, but of the possibility that people can find genuine happiness even after experiencing profound disappointment. The reception was held in our backyard, under the trees we'd planted together that spring. The garden we designed and cultivated provided the perfect backdrop for a celebration that felt both intimate and joyful. Emily gave a toast that made us both cry, talking about watching her mother bloom again after years of quiet sadness, and about how I'd become not just a stepfather but a true friend who made their small family feel complete. My brother David, never one for lengthy speeches, simply raised his glass and said, "To Michael and Susan, who prove that sometimes the best things in life come to those who wait for the right person rather than settling for the available one." As the evening wound down and our guests began to leave, Susan and I found ourselves alone in our garden, surrounded by the remnants of our perfect day. The string lights we'd hung in the trees cast a warm glow over the tables still laden with the remains of dinner, and the air was filled with the scent of the jasmine that was just beginning to bloom. "How do you feel, husband?" Susan asked, settling into my arms as we swayed to music that existed only in our heads. Complete, I said without hesitation. Not because you complete me, but because this life we've built together feels exactly right. No regrets about waiting until 57 to find the right person. I thought about her question seriously. None at all. I needed to become the person I am now to be able to appreciate what we have. The younger version of me might have taken this for granted, or tried to complicate it somehow. The younger version of me definitely would have, Susan agreed. I was so focused on trying to make relationships work through effort and compromise that I never considered the possibility of finding someone with whom love could be simple and natural. We danced in our garden until nearly midnight, talking about our honeymoon plans, our hopes for the future, and our gratitude for the unexpected turns that had brought us together. Neither of us had expected to find love again at this stage of our lives, but both of us recognized it as the deepest, most satisfying relationship either of us had ever experienced. 2 years later, as I write this story, I can say with complete confidence that our marriage has exceeded even our highest expectations. Susan and I have settled into rhythms that feel both comfortable and exciting, routines that provide stability without becoming boring. My business has continued to grow, now serving nearly twice as many clients as I had during my marriage to Patricia. Susan's financial portfolio has flourished under my conservative but effective management, and she's begun writing the cookbook she'd always dreamed of publishing. Emily graduated magna cum laude and landed a job with a respected magazine in Austin. She calls me Dad now, a development that still brings tears to my eyes. Ryan proposed to her last Christmas, and we're all looking forward to planning another family wedding. We hear occasional news about Patricia through mutual acquaintances. She did start her own consulting firm, and by all accounts, it's modestly successful. She's apparently dating someone new, a divorced attorney who seems better suited to her ambitious personality than I ever was. I wish her well, genuinely and without reservation. Her betrayal, devastating as it was at the time, led me to discoveries about myself and possibilities for happiness that I never could have imagined while trapped in our incompatible marriage. Susan often tells me that she believes everything happens for a reason, that the pain we both experienced in our previous relationships was necessary preparation for the joy we found together. I'm not sure I believe in cosmic design, but I do believe that adversity can teach us what we truly value, and that sometimes losing everything we thought we wanted is the first step toward finding everything we actually need. The most profound change in my life isn't the external circumstances, though those have certainly improved beyond my wildest expectations. It's the internal transformation, the way I've learned to trust my own judgment, value my own company, and understand that my contentment with simple pleasures isn't a character defect but a genuine strength. During my marriage to Patricia, I'd internalized her criticism to the point where I questioned my own instincts about everything from social situations to business decisions. I'd accepted her assessment that my preference for quiet evenings and meaningful conversations over networking events and power lunches was evidence of limited ambition rather than different priorities. Living with Susan has taught me that my instincts were right all along. The qualities Patricia saw as limitations are the very things that make me a good husband. Father figure, friend, and business partner. My methodical approach to problem solving. My preference for depth over breadth in relationships. My satisfaction with genuine success rather than ostentatious displays of wealth. These aren't compromises or settling. They're choices that reflect my actual values. Last month, Emily brought her fiancé Ryan to dinner. And as we sat around our kitchen table, discussing their wedding plans and career goals, I was struck by how natural this felt. The kind of multi-generational conversation Patricia had always found boring was exactly the kind of family interaction I'd always longed for. "You're so easy to talk to," Ryan told me later as we cleaned up the dishes while Susan and Emily looked through wedding magazines. "Emily told me about your first marriage, about how your ex-wife made you feel like you weren't ambitious enough. That's crazy. You've built exactly the kind of life most people dream of: successful business, beautiful home, strong relationships. What more could anyone want?" His perspective, unfiltered by Patricia's relentless drive for more, reminded me how distorted my view of success had become during those 28 years. I'd accepted her definition of achievement, constant growth, increasing prestige, ever higher levels of professional recognition, without questioning whether those goals aligned with my own sense of fulfillment. Now at 59, I understand that success isn't about having the most impressive career or the largest house or the busiest social calendar. It's about building a life that reflects your authentic priorities, maintaining relationships that enrich rather than exhaust you, and finding satisfaction in daily experiences rather than constantly striving for some future state of happiness. My consulting practice serves exactly the number of clients I want to serve, generating exactly the income I need to live comfortably without requiring the kind of aggressive expansion Patricia always pushed for. Susan and I travel when we want to, entertain when we feel like it, and spend quiet evenings at home without apologizing for our lack of social ambition. I love our boring life, Susan told me just last week as we sat on our back porch, reading different books and sharing the occasional observation about our respective stories. Me too, I said. Though I'm not sure I'd call it boring, peaceful, maybe, satisfying. Definitely satisfying, she agreed. Patricia's idea of an exciting life sounds exhausting to me. All that performance, all that striving, all that anxiety about keeping up appearances. The contrast couldn't be more stark. Where my first marriage had been characterized by constant undercurrent of tension, Patricia's dissatisfaction with our social status, my inadequacy as a partner, the gap between our current reality and her vision of what our life should look like. My marriage to Susan is characterized by genuine contentment with what we've built together. We still have goals and dreams, of course. Susan is working on a second cookbook, and I'm considering writing a book about financial planning for people approaching retirement. Emily and Ryan are saving for their own house, and we enjoy helping them navigate the practical aspects of building a life together. But these future plans don't cast a shadow over our present happiness. We pursue them because they interest us and bring us satisfaction, not because we need them to prove our worth or justify our existence. I think often about the security guard, Carl Martinez, whose innocent confusion that October afternoon set in motion the sequence of events that transformed my life. If he hadn't mistaken Scott Williams for Patricia's husband, if I hadn't been forced to confront the reality of my wife's double life, I might have continued living a lie indefinitely. The thought is both terrifying and sobering. How many more years would I have spent trying to be enough for someone who had already decided I wasn't? How much more of myself would I have sacrificed in service of a relationship that was fundamentally dishonest? Carl's mistake, devastating as it felt at the time, was actually a gift. It forced me to face truths I'd been unconsciously avoiding, to develop strengths I didn't know I possessed, and ultimately to find happiness I'd never imagined possible. Sometimes the most loving thing the universe can do is destroy the illusions we've built our lives around, even when that destruction feels like the end of everything we thought we wanted. Patricia's betrayal taught me that I'm stronger than I knew, more valuable than I believed, and capable of happiness I'd never dared to imagine. Her elaborate deception intended to facilitate my replacement, instead facilitated my liberation. I don't think she intended to do me a favor, of course. She was pursuing her own interests, following her own desires, making choices based on her own priorities. But the unintended consequence of her selfishness was my freedom from a relationship that had been slowly suffocating my authentic self. This morning, as I write the final pages of this story, Susan is in the kitchen making coffee, humming along to the radio, preparing for another day in the life we've built together. The sound fills our house with the kind of ordinary joy I never experienced during my first marriage. In a few hours, Emily will call to update us on her wedding planning. This evening, we'll work in our garden, preparing the flower beds for spring planting. Tonight, we'll read together on our couch, sharing the comfortable silence that comes from being with someone who doesn't need you to be anyone other than who you are. These simple routines, these ordinary moments of connection and shared purpose, represent everything I thought I had in my first marriage, but never actually possessed. Patricia and I had routines too, but they were performances, carefully choreographed interactions designed to maintain the appearance of domestic harmony while hiding the fundamental disconnect between what she needed and what I could offer. With Susan, there's no performance, no pretense, no sense that either of us is settling for something less than we deserve. We chose each other with full knowledge of who we actually are, complete with limitations and imperfections, and we continue choosing each other every day. The lesson I've learned, the one I wish I could somehow communicate to my younger self, is that authentic compatibility is infinitely more valuable than passionate intensity. The relationship I thought was love was actually a form of mutual accommodation that left both of us fundamentally unsatisfied, though for different reasons. Patricia needed someone who shared her driving ambition, who would push her toward bigger goals and greater achievements. I needed someone who appreciated contentment, who could find joy in simple pleasures and quiet accomplishments. Neither of us was wrong for having those needs, but we were profoundly wrong for each other. The tragedy of my first marriage wasn't that it ended in betrayal and divorce. The tragedy was that it lasted 28 years, preventing both of us from finding partners who could actually appreciate our authentic selves. Patricia spent nearly 3 decades trying to motivate someone who was already fulfilled, while I spent the same period trying to satisfy someone who would never find me stimulating enough. If Patricia had been honest about her dissatisfaction earlier, if I had been more attuned to the signs of her growing disengagement, we might have separated amicably and found more suitable partners years sooner. Instead, we both invested decades in a relationship that was fundamentally mismatched, creating resentment and disappointment that made the eventual end far more painful than it needed to be. I don't blame Patricia for wanting more than I could offer. Ambition, drive, and the desire for constant growth aren't character flaws. They're simply incompatible with my own temperament and values. What I do blame her for is the way she chose to handle that incompatibility, through deception, manipulation, and systematic undermining of my confidence rather than honest communication about our differences. The same outcome, the end of our marriage, could have been achieved with far less damage to both of us if she had chosen courage over cowardice, honesty over duplicity. We could have divorced as two people who'd discovered they were incompatible rather than as betrayer and betrayed. But I've learned not to spend too much energy on alternate histories. What happened, happened. The choices Patricia made, however painful they were at the time, led me to exactly where I needed to be. I discovered strengths I didn't know I possessed, developed confidence I'd never had, and ultimately found happiness that exceeds anything I experienced during my first marriage. The man who was devastated by his wife's betrayal 3 years ago has become someone who understands his own worth, trusts his own judgment, and refuses to accept love that comes with conditions or requirements for self-improvement. Susan's love is a gift freely given, not a prize to be earned through constant effort and adaptation. She appreciates my dry humor, my methodical approach to problems, my preference for depth over breadth in all areas of life. With her, I don't need to be more social, more ambitious, or more anything. I simply need to be myself. That self, it turns out, is someone worth loving. I think about this transformation often when I'm working with clients who are facing their own relationship challenges or life transitions. The financial planning work I do is really about helping people align their resources with their authentic priorities, and I've learned that the same principles apply to relationships. You can't build a sustainable future based on who you think you should be rather than who you actually are. You can't create lasting happiness by trying to meet someone else's definition of success, and you can't maintain authentic intimacy with someone who needs you to be fundamentally different from your natural self. These insights, learned through painful experience, have made me a better financial advisor, a better husband, a better friend, and a better person. Patricia's betrayal, devastating as it was, forced me to examine assumptions about myself and my relationships that I'd never questioned. The result is a life that feels genuinely mine in ways my previous existence never did. Every choice Susan and I make together reflects our shared values and mutual preferences. Every goal we pursue enhances our current happiness rather than deferring it to some future state of achievement. We're not perfect people living a perfect life. We have disagreements, face challenges, and navigate the ordinary difficulties that all couples encounter. But we handle these issues as partners, with honesty and mutual respect rather than as adversaries keeping score or building cases against each other. That might sound simple, even obvious, but after 28 years of marriage where every conflict felt like a referendum on my adequacy as a partner, the experience of working through problems with someone who assumes good faith and shares fundamental values is nothing short of revelatory. Next week, Susan and I will celebrate our second wedding anniversary. We're planning a quiet dinner at the restaurant where we had our first official date, followed by an evening at home in the garden we've tended together. No grand gestures, no expensive trips, no elaborate celebrations designed to impress others. Just two people who chose each other carefully, honestly, and completely, taking time to appreciate how far we've traveled together and how much happiness we've managed to build from the ruins of our previous disappointments. Patricia taught me what I don't want in a relationship, the exhausting performance of trying to be someone I'm not to earn love. That's always conditional. Susan taught me what I do want, the peaceful satisfaction of being fully known and completely accepted by someone whose authentic self I cherish in return. The difference between those two experiences is the difference between a life spent trying to earn love and a life spent sharing it freely. If you're reading this story and recognizing elements of your own relationship struggles, I want you to know that it's never too late to choose authenticity over accommodation. It's never too late to stop trying to be enough for someone who has decided you're not. And it's never too late to find someone who will appreciate exactly who you are right now without requiring you to become someone different. The signs of incompatibility aren't always as dramatic as secret apartments and elaborate deception. Sometimes they're as subtle as feeling like you need permission to be yourself, like your natural instincts are somehow wrong. Like love is something you have to continuously earn rather than something that's freely given. If you find yourself constantly adapting, constantly compromising core parts of your identity, constantly feeling like you're not quite enough despite your best efforts, you might be in the wrong relationship with someone who could be wonderful for someone else, but isn't right for you. That doesn't make either of you bad people. It just makes you incompatible people who deserve to find partners who will appreciate your authentic selves rather than requiring you to become someone different. The courage to end relationships that aren't working, even long-established ones, even ones that look successful from the outside, is one of the most important gifts you can give yourself and your partner. Staying in mismatched relationships doesn't demonstrate loyalty or commitment. It demonstrates fear of the unknown and lack of faith in your ability to build something better. I spent 28 years in a marriage that looked successful to everyone who knew us but felt hollow to both participants. Patricia and I both wasted decades trying to force compatibility where none existed, creating resentment and disappointment that made the inevitable end far more painful than it needed to be. If we had been honest about our fundamental differences earlier, if either of us had had the courage to acknowledge that good people can be wrong for each other, we both might have found appropriate partners years sooner and avoided the elaborate deception that poisoned our final years together. I'm grateful now for Patricia's betrayal, strange as that might sound, because it forced me to confront truths I'd been avoiding and to develop strengths I didn't know I possessed. But I wish the lesson had come through honest communication rather than systematic deception. For anyone facing similar challenges, whether you're the one feeling unappreciated or the one feeling trapped by someone else's expectations, I encourage you to choose honesty over harmony, authenticity over accommodation, and courage over comfort. The conversations might be difficult, the transitions might be painful, but the alternative, spending decades trying to force relationships that aren't naturally compatible, is far worse. Life is too short to spend it trying to be someone you're not to earn love that should be freely given. You deserve a partner who appreciates your authentic self, who enhances your natural strengths rather than focusing on your supposed weaknesses, who shares your fundamental values even if you have different interests. Such people exist. Susan is proof of that. At 48, she'd given up on finding love again after her husband's death. At 56, I thought my capacity for genuine partnership had been permanently damaged by Patricia's betrayal. We were both wrong. The right person appeared at exactly the right time, when we'd both learned enough about ourselves to recognize authentic compatibility when we found it. Your story might be different from mine, but the principles remain the same. Authentic love doesn't require performance or pretense. Healthy relationships enhance your sense of self rather than requiring you to diminish it. Good partners appreciate who you are rather than focusing on who you could become with sufficient improvement. Trust your instincts about what feels right in relationships. Trust your own definition of success and happiness rather than accepting someone else's version. Trust that you deserve love that feels generous rather than conditional, supportive rather than critical, enhancing rather than diminishing. Most importantly, trust that it's never too late to start over, to make different choices, to find relationships that truly fit rather than ones that merely function. As I finish writing this story, Susan is calling me to come see something in our garden. The roses we planted last spring are blooming for the first time, displaying colors we could only imagine when we selected them from the nursery catalog. It's a perfect metaphor for the life we've built together. Something we planted with hope and tended with patience that has grown into beauty exceeding our expectations. I'm 59 years old, married to my soulmate, stepfather to a wonderful young woman, successful in work that feels meaningful rather than merely profitable, and happier than I ever imagined possible. The journey here included pain I wouldn't wish on anyone, but it also included discoveries about resilience, self-worth, and the possibility of love that I never could have made while trapped in a relationship that required me to be someone other than myself. Patricia's elaborate betrayal intended to facilitate my replacement, instead facilitated my liberation. Her systematic deception, designed to ease her transition to a new life, forced me to build a new life of my own. I began this story by saying I never thought a simple surprise visit would shatter everything I believed about my marriage. That's true. But what I didn't know then was that sometimes the most devastating destruction leads to the most beautiful reconstruction. Sometimes you have to lose everything you thought you wanted to discover everything you actually need. And sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the first step toward the best thing that ever happened to you. If you're in that dark place where everything seems broken beyond repair, where betrayal has shattered your faith in love and trust, I want you to know that rebuilding is possible. Not just returning to where you were before, but creating something better than you ever imagined. The security guard was right that day when he said he saw her husband every day. He just didn't know he was talking to the husband she was replacing rather than the husband she was keeping. Sometimes being replaced is the greatest gift you never knew you needed. My name is Michael Thompson, and this is the story of how losing my marriage led me to find my life. Sometimes the worst betrayal becomes the greatest liberation. When someone replaces you, they free you to find where you truly belong. The person who thinks you're not enough is simply the wrong person to judge your worth. Your value doesn't decrease because someone failed to see it.